There's a folder on my laptop I've been quietly adding to for a while now. No project deadlines inside it, no to-do lists, just dreams. Fragments mostly, half-remembered scenes that started dissolving the moment I opened my eyes. But I kept writing them down anyway. It started as an experiment, something about wanting to hold on to those strange little worlds a bit longer. A mind map, really. A quiet chronicle of wherever my brain goes when I let it off the leash. And somewhere along the way, it became something I actually look forward to. That slow ritual. Wake up, don't move too fast, let the images settle. Then open the laptop and try to catch what's already starting to slip away. We don't have the technology yet, and I genuinely dream of the day we do, where you could replay your dreams like rewinding a VHS tape. Press play, and there it is, the version of your life your sleeping mind decided to live out while the rest of you was somewhere else entirely. For now, though, it's just us and our keyboards. Or maybe a voice recorder, a crumpled notebook on the nightstand. Whatever works. Writing it down is like snapping a mental photo, the photographic memory your smartphone has no lens for. Some mornings the dream is vivid enough that I'm almost still inside it. Other times I'm chasing shadows, a feeling more than a scene. But even then, I write something, even a mood, even a color. And here's what I've noticed. The benefit doesn't really come from trying to decode every symbol, every strange plot twist. I'm not sitting there with a dream dictionary trying to figure out what it means that I was late to an exam I never took. It's more about the texture of the dream, the overall shape of it. Because a lot of what shows up in there, the longing, the searching, the places I keep returning to, it tells me something. Not in a mystical way necessarily, just in the quiet, honest way that only comes when the noise of the day has finally gone to bed. Dreams have always felt like a free hallucinogenic trip to me. Sometimes therapeutic, sometimes genuinely unsettling. Sometimes so thought-provoking that I spend the rest of the morning turning them over like a strange coin I found in my pocket. We spend roughly a third of our lives asleep. A slice of that, sometimes a surprisingly large slice, is lived in some other dimension entirely. Maybe it's the subconscious unwinding all the stimuli that never quite got resolved. The unfinished conversations, the unprocessed moments, the things you almost said. Who really knows? What I do know is that since I started keeping this record, something shifted. A kind of attentiveness crept in. Like my sleeping mind started trying a little harder knowing someone would be there in the morning to listen. If you've never tried this, even for a week, just as an experiment, a cup of tea, a quiet morning, and whatever your brain was doing while you were gone, I'd be curious what you might find waiting for you there. There's a particular kind of loss that happens before you're even fully awake. You're still lying there, eyes closed, the dream right there with you, and then almost the instant you shift, it starts going. Not all at once. It peels away in layers. First the story, then the details, then the feeling, until all you're left with is a vague emotional residue and the frustrating sense that something just slipped through your fingers. Scientists have a name for this: dream decay. The rapid forgetting that sets in almost the moment consciousness returns. And there's something almost poetic about it, this nightly amnesia we all quietly sign up for. We go somewhere vivid and strange and completely our own, and then we come back to the waking world with almost no evidence that any of it happened. What I find strange is how normalized that is. We don't mourn it. We don't even really notice it most mornings. We just roll over, check our phones, and let whatever happened in the night dissolve into the day without a second thought. Like returning from a trip and throwing away all the photos. But here's what changes when you start writing things down. You start to notice the window, that narrow, fragile window right after waking, maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5, where the dream is still present, still hovering, where if you stay still enough and reach for it carefully, you can actually catch some of it before it goes. It sounds small, and it is, technically, but there's something quietly radical about deciding that those memories are worth saving. That the hours you spent somewhere else, somewhere your conscious mind didn't design or control, are part of your experience too, worth archiving, worth returning to. The interesting thing is what happens to your relationship with sleep once you start. It stops feeling like a gap in your day. It starts feeling more like a chapter you haven't read yet. You wake up differently, with a kind of low-grade curiosity instead of just an alarm and a to-do list, wondering what got written in there while the rest of you was somewhere else entirely. I've noticed, too, that the act of catching these things changes what you notice during the day. You become more attuned to certain feelings, a mood you can't quite source, a sense of unease that doesn't belong to anything in particular. And sometimes you'll trace it back, realize it came from something in the night, something you almost forgot, something your sleeping mind was working on that you didn't even know was on the agenda. There's a theory, and I find it genuinely interesting, that the dreams we forget fastest are often the most emotionally charged. That the very mechanism designed to protect us from psychological overload is also the one erasing the most meaningful material. Which means the ones that survive, the fragments that actually make it through to morning, might be the ones worth paying the most attention to. You don't have to build a whole practice around this. You don't need a system or a method or a special notebook with a leather cover. All that really takes are a few seconds of stillness. A decision made before you move to stay with whatever is still there, to let it surface, to reach for it before the day rushes in and takes it. Because once the window closes, and it closes fast, you're not getting that back. Whatever was there is gone. Return to wherever dreams go when no one is paying attention. Here's something worth sitting with. Every night, while you're unconscious and completely unaware, your brain is running scenarios, rehearsals, practice rounds, emotional simulations of situations you haven't faced yet or haven't resolved. And you wake up with almost no memory of any of it. There's a theory in sleep science that one of the functions of dreaming is threat rehearsal. The idea that the sleeping mind uses the relatively safe environment of a dream to process experiences it hasn't finished digesting. Fear responses, social conflicts, unresolved grief, the kinds of things that don't have neat endings in waking life. Which would explain a lot, honestly. Why so many dreams feel like they're about something just slightly off from what they're actually about. Why you keep ending up in the same setting, facing a version of the same problem, wearing different clothes. Your sleeping mind is trying something, iterating, running the scenario again to see if this time it resolves differently. What I find quietly remarkable about this is what it implies about the nature of emotional intelligence. We tend to think of growth as something that happens consciously, something we decide to pursue, something we work at with intention and effort. But here's your brain, every single night, doing its own version of that work without you, processing what the day left unfinished, simulating, sorting, occasionally discarding, running maintenance on your inner life while you sleep. When you start keeping a dream journal, you start to see the patterns, and patterns are where it gets interesting. The same unnamed anxiety showing up in different costumes, the same location appearing months apart, the same relationship dynamic playing out in completely different dream narratives, as if the dream is trying different framings of the same unresolved thing. It's not that the dreams are giving you answers. In my experience, they rarely do that. It's more that they're pointing, circling something, returning to it patiently in a way that feels less like obsession and more like persistence, like something genuinely trying to get your attention. There's also something interesting about the dreams that feel completely random, the ones with no apparent logic, no emotional center, no obvious connection to anything in your life. Even those, when you write them down and let them sit for a few days, sometimes reveal a thread you didn't see at first, a detail that connects to something you were thinking about last week, a feeling that makes more sense in retrospect. I'm not suggesting that every dream is a coded message waiting to be decoded. That kind of thinking can spiral into something less useful pretty quickly. But there's a middle ground between decoding and dismissing, a mode of engagement that's more like listening than translating, paying attention without needing to immediately understand. And that mode, it turns out, is useful for more than just dreams. There's a kind of patience it builds, a tolerance for ambiguity, a willingness to sit with something unresolved without immediately reaching for a conclusion, which, in a world that rewards fast answers and confident takes, is actually a fairly rare thing to have. The dreams that feel most like noise are sometimes the ones that, looked at sideways, have the most to say. There are dreams I still carry from years ago. Not because I was keeping a journal back then, I wasn't, but because something in them was precise enough, or strange enough, or emotionally accurate enough that all the waking life in between hasn't managed to cover them over. One of them is just a place, somewhere that doesn't exist on any map, a quality of light, a feeling of standing somewhere that felt more real than most places I've actually been, and I can still access it. Not the narrative around it, just the feeling, the way it felt to be there. The dreams that stay tend not to be the dramatic ones. You'd think it would be the nightmares, the ones with the most obvious emotional charge. But in my experience, those fade at roughly the same rate as everything else. What tends to survive is something quieter. A dream where nothing much happens, but the emotional register is so exact, so strangely precise, that you carry it around for the rest of the day, sometimes for years. Sleep researchers have explored this. The current thinking is that emotional intensity plays a significant role in dream consolidation, that the brain tags emotionally significant experiences for retention, the same way it does with memories from waking life. Which would mean that what persists isn't random. Your brain made a decision about what to keep. And that raises a question worth sitting with. What does it mean that your brain chose to retain that particular thing, that image, that feeling, that unnamed interaction in some corridor of a place you've never been? What was it about that your brain flagged as important? I think what's interesting isn't necessarily finding the answer. It's the fact that the question is even available to you, that there's a record of something your mind considered worth keeping, even when you weren't deliberately trying to keep it. When you start writing dreams down, you give yourself more of these records, more data points, more material to look back on months later and notice that something has been showing up repeatedly, wearing different faces, playing out in different settings, but carrying the same essential feeling every time. And the ones that stay without being written, the ones that survive years of ordinary life without being deliberately preserved, those feel like they might be worth paying particular attention to. Like your mind puts something aside for you, knowing you'd eventually be ready to look at it. There's also something interesting about the gap between the dream as experienced and the dream as remembered, because you're never actually remembering the dream itself. You're remembering your last memory of the dream, which has already been shaped and edited and colored by everything that came after, by the mood you woke up in, by what you decided to notice, by the story you started telling yourself about what it meant. So in some sense, the dream that stays isn't the original dream at all. It's a collaboration between whatever happened in the night and the person you were when you woke up and decided it mattered, which makes it yours in a way that's harder to account for, and somehow more interesting because of it. The most common reason people give for not keeping a dream journal is that they don't remember their dreams. And I get that. For a long time, I assumed I was just someone who didn't dream vividly, or who dreamed and then forgot so completely that it amounted to the same thing. What changed wasn't some technique or biohack. It was simply deciding before falling asleep that I was going to try to remember. That's it. Just intention. The expectation of recall seems to prime something, like telling your mind, this is going to matter in the morning, so hold on to it. The second shift was what I did in the first 60 seconds after waking, which is the whole game really, because the window is narrow, extremely narrow. Whatever you do in those first moments, check your phone, get up, start mentally planning your day, that's what determines whether you get anything out. The dream doesn't wait. So the practice, such as it is, comes down to this. Stay still. Let the images surface. Don't chase them, just let them come. And then reach for whatever you're using to write before you do anything else. The format doesn't really matter. Some people swear by handwriting. There's something about the slower pace of it, the way the hand moves at a speed closer to the speed of remembering, that seems to pull more detail through. Others prefer voice memos, whispering into a phone before you fully opened your eyes. And there's something to that too. The voice carries tone in a way that words on a page sometimes lose. You can hear the uncertainty, the wonder, the slight discomfort of trying to put language around something that doesn't quite have language yet. For dreams that don't feel linear, the ones that are more like impressions than narratives, some people find sketching works better than writing. A rough shape, a color, a spatial sense of where things were relative to each other. Sometimes that's actually more accurate than trying to translate the dream into a story it never was. What I'd push back on is the idea that you need to produce something polished, or that a few fragments aren't worth capturing. Even a single image, a feeling, a sentence that starts with, "I will somewhere," and doesn't go anywhere, that's still something. That's still contact with a part of your experience that most people just let dissolve every morning. You don't need to spend an hour on this. 5 minutes, maybe less. Just enough to get something down before the day starts covering it over. What tends to happen over time is that the process starts to feel less effortful. The memory gets better. Not because your dreams are changing, but because you're changing the relationship with them. You're telling your brain repeatedly that this is something you're paying attention to. And the brain, as it turns out, responds to that. It's a small practice, quieter than most of the things we're told will change our lives. But there's something in the consistency of it, the daily act of turning inward before the world gets loud, that builds something over time. Something harder to name than a skill, but unmistakably there. Something unexpected happened around the third or fourth week of keeping a consistent dream journal. The dreams got richer, more detailed, more layered, more willing somehow to offer up their imagery. And I remember thinking, that's strange. What changed? The science has some thoughts on this. Dream recall, the simple act of intending to remember, of expecting that the night will produce something worth capturing, does appear to increase both the vividness and the recollection of dreams over time. There's a feedback loop built into the practice. What you pay attention to expands. Your sleeping mind, receiving the signal that its output is being received, seems to produce more of it. But what surprised me more than the dreams themselves was what the practice was doing to the rest of my day. There's a particular quality of attention that dream journaling seems to cultivate, a willingness to sit with something ambiguous without immediately reaching for an interpretation, to let a thought or an image exist without labeling it, without needing to know right away what it means or what to do with it. That's actually a harder skill than it sounds. Most of the environments we move through reward quick answers, confident takes, decisive action, moving on. The dream practice cuts against all of that. It asks you to hold something loosely, to stay curious about it without closing the question. And that, over time, starts showing up in other places, in conversations that are more complicated than they appear on the surface, in creative work, especially, where the most interesting things often live on the edge of something you can't quite name yet, in decisions that don't have obvious answers and probably shouldn't be rushed. There's a word I keep coming back to, which is receptivity, the ability to receive information from a conversation, from a creative problem, from your own emotional state. Just letting it land, letting it sit, trusting that something useful will emerge from that if you give it enough space. Dream journaling, as a practice, is essentially training that muscle every morning. You wake up, you reach for whatever came in the night, and you hold it without an agenda. You don't try to decode it immediately. You don't dismiss it if it doesn't make sense. You just write it down and let it be what it is. Over months, that adds up. I can't point to a single moment where I noticed a shift. It's more like the slow accumulation of a posture, a way of engaging with uncertain things that feels less anxious than it used to, less compelled to resolve everything on contact. The irony is that the practice that seemed most passive, lying still, catching fragments and writing them down, turned out to produce something more durable than a lot of the more effortful things I've tried. Not a technique, not a framework, just a changed relationship with the part of experience that most people quietly abandon every morning. A willingness to take the interior life seriously, on its own terms, at its own pace. Imagine being able to press play on last night's dream. Not a written description of it, not a rough sketch or a voice memo of yourself half asleep, murmuring fragments into your phone. The actual thing. Visuals, feeling, narrative, played back the way you'd watch a film. This is not entirely science fiction anymore. Researchers have been working on it. Using fMRI data combined with machine learning models, teams have been able to reconstruct crude visual approximations of what subjects were looking at, and in some cases, what they were dreaming about. The results are blurry, impressionistic, more Turner painting than cinema, but the direction is clear, and the pace of progress in this area is not slow. And sitting with that possibility for a moment, really sitting with it, raises questions that I don't think have obvious answers. The first one is, would you want this? If the technology existed, if it were accessible and reasonably accurate, would you actually want to watch your dreams back? Part of me immediately says yes. The part that has spent time trying to catch these things every morning, frustrated by how much slips away before I can get to the keyboard. The idea of having all of it, perfectly preserved, available to revisit, has a real appeal. But there's another part of the question worth sitting with. Dreams might depend, at least in part, on their elusiveness. The way a dream transforms in the act of remembering it. The way you fill in the gaps with feeling rather than fact. The way the version you write down is already a collaboration between what actually happened in the night and who you were in the moment of catching it. Would a recording capture that? Or would it flatten it, reduce it to data in a way that misses the whole point? And then there's the question that keeps surfacing whenever I think about this seriously: privacy. We're already navigating a world where extraordinary amounts of personal information are being collected, stored, analyzed, and sometimes sold. Health data, location data, browsing behavior, emotional responses inferred from typing patterns and voice tone. But dreams are something else entirely. Your unguarded, unperformed, uncurated inner world. The place where nothing is calculated for an audience, where the social layer you wear all day finally comes off. What would it mean for that to exist somewhere outside your own skull? Who would have access? On what terms? The dream recording technology is coming in some form. It may arrive gradually enough that we don't notice the moment we cross the threshold. The way most significant technological shifts seem to happen, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a slow accumulation of incremental things until one day you look up and the world is different. The question worth asking now, before the technology gets there, is what we actually want from it, what we're willing to trade, and whether there are spaces inside our own experience that should remain by some kind of collective agreement, beyond the reach of any system or platform or algorithm. The dream might be the last frontier of the genuinely private, worth thinking about before someone builds a door into it. Most of us have a rough sense by now of how much of our waking life gets tracked, where we go, what we buy, what we search for, how long we look at something before scrolling past, what our faces do when we watch certain kinds of content. It's not always sinister. Some of it is genuinely useful. Some of it is just the invisible infrastructure of how the modern internet works. But there's something worth noticing about the cumulative effect of living in a world where so much of your experience is being observed, measured, and fed back to you as data. You start to perform without quite meaning to. You curate, even privately. You become aware at some low level that things are being recorded. And that awareness shapes behavior in ways that are subtle enough to miss, but significant enough to matter. Sleep might be the last genuinely off-grid experience most of us have. The hours when the tracking goes quiet, when the apps stop counting your steps, and the algorithms stop serving you content. And whatever you're experiencing is happening entirely outside the reach of any external system. There's something worth protecting about that. Not in a paranoid way. More in the way you'd feel about any space that lets you be genuinely unperformed. Where you're not building anything, not optimizing anything, not saying the right thing or presenting the right version of yourself. Just existing in the full, unedited, uncurated way that only seems to happen when no one, including yourself, is watching. Dream journaling in that context takes on a slightly different meaning. It's not feeding your dreams to a platform. It's engaging with them on your own terms. Creating a private record of a private experience that exists in a notebook or a file on your own device, for no audience and no algorithm and no external system of any kind. That kind of inwardness feels increasingly unusual and maybe increasingly necessary, because the more external the world gets, the louder, the more connected, the more persistently present in every moment, the more valuable the interior life becomes. Not as a retreat from reality, as a kind of ballast, a place that remains yours regardless of what's happening outside. There's a line of thinking in philosophy that suggests the self is constructed through attention, that what you pay attention to, consistently and over time, is in some meaningful sense what you become. If that's true, and I find it more convincing the longer I sit with it, then directing some of that attention inward, toward the part of your experience that happens beyond observation, is an act of genuine self-determination. Choosing what to notice, choosing what to preserve, choosing, in a world that's constantly vying for your attention from the outside, to reserve some of it for the inside. The dream space has always been private. The question is whether we're going to keep it that way, and whether we even recognize what we'd be losing if we didn't. Here's something that started to shift the longer I kept this practice. A growing suspicion that the division between conscious and unconscious, between the thinking self I identify with during the day and whatever's running the show at night, is a lot blurrier than I'd assumed. We tend to talk about the subconscious as if it's a separate department, a basement where things get stored that are too heavy or too strange to keep upstairs. Something operating in parallel, occasionally sending memos up through dreams or slips of the tongue. But fundamentally, other. Fundamentally, not quite you. But sitting with a dream journal long enough, a different picture starts to emerge. Less a two-floor house and more a single mind with different operating modes. One mode runs on language, logic, social presentation, and the constant low-level awareness that the world is watching. The other runs at night when none of that scaffolding is required, when the performance can stop. What's interesting and slightly humbling is which mode seems to get closer to the truth. In waking life, we edit ourselves constantly. We know what we're supposed to feel about a situation. We know which version of a story makes us look better. We know how to perform competence and confidence and ease, even when the actual internal experience is something messier. In dreams, none of that is available. The editing tools are offline. What shows up is more direct, more honest about what's actually unresolved, what's actually longed for, what actually frightens you at a level deeper than the one you'd admit to. There's a version of self-knowledge that comes from the kind of introspection we usually think of. Sitting with a journal, talking to a therapist, turning a problem over consciously until you understand it better. And that version is real and valuable. But there's another kind, the kind that surfaces through dreams, through the imagery and emotion and situations your sleeping mind keeps returning to. That often gets at things the conscious version can't quite reach, because the conscious version knows what it's looking for. It goes looking for specific things and finds them. The dreaming mind doesn't know what it's looking for. It just surfaces what's actually there. When you start writing that down, not to decode it, just to receive it, you start to accumulate a picture. Not a complete picture, but something more textured and honest than the one you'd construct from waking reflection alone. The shape of what you keep returning to, the emotional weather that runs beneath the surface of ordinary days, the things you haven't quite let yourself want yet, showing up anyway in some form your sleeping mind decided was safe enough to explore. There's a certain humility that comes from taking your dreams seriously, from recognizing that the version of you that runs at night has access to things the daytime version is still working up to, and that the gap between those two versions, if you're paying attention, is actually a very interesting place to live. We've covered a lot of ground in this video, and I want to take a moment before the end to pull the thread through. Because what started as a simple idea, keeping a record of your dreams, turned out to open onto something considerably larger. We talked about the window, that narrow space after waking where the dream is still available, still present enough to catch if you're still enough and fast enough. And about how the act of catching it, consistently, over time, changes not just what you remember, but what your sleeping mind produces. We talked about what the brain is actually doing in there, the simulations it runs, the emotional sorting, the unresolved things it keeps returning to, patiently in different forms, as if it knows something the waking mind hasn't gotten around to acknowledging yet. We talked about the ones that stay, the dreams from years ago that haven't faded, and what it might mean that your brain made a decision to hold on to those particular things. What you might learn from examining what it chose to keep. We looked at the practice itself, how simple it actually is when you strip away the pressure to do it right. A few minutes, stillness, whatever format gets the most out before the window closes. No system required, just attention directed inward before the day takes over. And then we turn toward the horizon, toward the technology that's quietly being developed to reconstruct dreams, and the questions that follow it about privacy and access, and what it would mean for the last genuinely untracked space in our experience to become legible to an external system. Through all of it, one idea kept surfacing: that the interior life, the hours you don't fully remember, the imagery that surfaces without being invited, the emotional weather that runs beneath the ordinary days, is part of your experience, not a footnote to it, not background noise, part of the fabric. We spend roughly a third of our lives asleep, a portion of that in dream space. That's not a small number, and most of us engage with it the same way every morning. We don't. We surface, we orient, we reach for whatever needs doing, and whatever happened in the night fades without anyone noticing. This practice doesn't ask for much. It asks for a few minutes of stillness at the start of the day, a willingness to take seriously something that the culture mostly treats as irrelevant, a decision to treat the full 24 hours as your experience, not just the half you're awake for. What tends to happen when you do that, when you start showing up for the part of your life that happens in the dark, is that things start connecting. Patterns emerge that weren't visible before. Something in the quality of the days changes in a way that's hard to attribute to anything specific, but feels unmistakably real. So here's what I keep coming back to, and maybe you will too. If your sleeping mind has been somewhere every night, running simulations, working through what the day left unfinished, circling something you haven't quite let yourself look at directly, what do you think it's been trying to tell you? And what might change if you finally started listening?